Beneath the vaulted gloom of Castle Blackthorn's bridal chamber, Lady Seraphine Vale stood alone before a dying fire, her white silk gown trembling like frost upon winter branches, tears veiled yet unbroken upon her lashes. The man to whom fate and ruinous debt had delivered her, Lord Cashen Blackthorn, 48 winters deep, silver-maned and storm-eyed, had entered only moments before, placed a small ebony box upon the mantel, and withdrawn with a bow so courtly it felt like mercy. Now the latch clicked shut behind him, leaving her to the hush of crashing sea beyond the arrow-slit windows and the weight of what she feared must come. If you haven't yet, click the subscribe button now, because what lies within that box will change everything forever. Her fingers, pale as moonlit marble, lifted the lid with the reverence of one opening a sepulchre. Inside rested not jewels of ownership, nor tokens of expected submission, but a single iron key and a parchment sealed in midnight wax. The words, penned in his precise, unhurried hand, burned brighter than any flame. This key locks your door from within. The choice of when or whether it ever turns again belongs solely to you. No heart should be commanded into love. In that instant, the young bride who had walked to her doom beneath the pitying gaze of an entire province felt the first fracture in the chains she had worn since birth. The bells of St. Eloan's Cathedral tolled across the cliffs of Vermore like the slow heartbeat of an ancient, grieving sea. Salt wind whipped through the open doors, carrying the tang of kelp and winter brine, as Lady Seraphine Vale was led down the aisle upon her brother's arm. Her gown of ivory silk clung to her slight frame like seafoam frozen mid-crash, its train hissing softly over the worn stone flags. A veil of Brussels lace trembled before her face, half concealment, half cage, and beneath it her lips were bloodless, her eyes wide with the luminous dread of a creature walking willingly into the net. The nave was filled with the province's oldest blood, lords in charcoal velvet, ladies in storm-gray satin, their plumes and pearls nodding like gulls above a wreck. Their gazes followed her progress with the avid pity reserved for sacrificial offerings. "So young," murmured the Countess of Dunrock behind her fan. "Barely 21, and given to Blackthorn himself." Another voice, sharper. Her father's debts were heavier than his honor. What choice had she? The words drifted to Seraphine's ears like smoke. She did not flinch, only kept her chin high and her hands folded so tightly around the bouquet of white heather and dried lavender that thorns pricked through her gloves. At the altar waited Lord Cashen Blackthorn, tall and unyielding as the castle he ruled. 48 years had silvered his hair to the color of moonlit surf and carved deep channels beside his mouth. Yet his shoulders beneath the black wool coat were broad, his posture immaculate. Storm-gray eyes regarded her approach without warmth or cruelty, only a grave, measuring stillness, as though he weighed the cost of what was about to transpire and found it equal on both sides. No hunger flickered there, no triumph, only the austere dignity of a man who had long ago learned to master expectation. The bishop's voice rolled through the vaulting like distant thunder, intoning vows older than the stones beneath their feet. Seraphine heard herself speak the responses, clear, steady, miraculous in their composure, though inside she felt hollow, a shell echoing with the crash of waves far below the cliff. When the ancestral ring of the Blackthorns, heavy gold worked with ravens and thorns, slid over her knuckle, it felt colder than the sea wind, heavier than any shackle. Cashen's hand was warm, briefly, surprisingly so, but he released her the instant the rite allowed, as though reluctant to claim even that small contact. No kiss followed. In Vermore, ancient custom permitted the groom to forbear the bridal kiss if the match was one of alliance rather than affection. Cashen inclined his head in grave acknowledgement instead, and the congregation exhaled a collective breath of scandalized sympathy. Afterward, in the cathedral porch, the wind tore at veils and cloaks while guests offered congratulations thin as winter ice. Seraphine's stepmother, Lady Morven, pressed a cool cheek to hers and whispered, "Bear it with grace, child. You are a lord's wife now. Many would kill for such elevation." Her brother, white-faced and avoiding her eyes, muttered only, "Forgive me," before hurrying away. No one else dared more than a curtsy or a bow. The Blackthorn name carried too many shadows. The carriage that awaited them was black lacquered, drawn by 4 iron-gray horses. Inside, the seats were deep crimson leather, the windows curtained in velvet the color of spilled wine. As the door closed, the roar of the sea and the murmur of the crowd were suddenly muffled, replaced by the creak of harness and the rhythmic thud of hooves on the cliff road. Seraphine sat opposite her new husband, hands folded in her lap, staring at the rain beginning to streak the glass. Neither spoke. For an hour they traveled thus, the storm gathering strength until the world beyond the windows dissolved into gray torrents. Lightning revealed, in brief violent flashes, the sheer drop to the raging sea on their left and the rising moorland on their right. Castle Blackthorn loomed somewhere ahead, perched upon its promontory like a dark thought made stone. At last Cashin broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate, pitched to carry over the storm yet not raise above it. "You need not fear mistreatment at my hands, Lady Blackthorn." The new title sounded strange in her ears, foreign as a dead language. "I am not the monster rumor paints." Seraphine turned to him then, veil pushed back, rainlight glittering on the tears she had refused to shed in public. "And yet, my lord," she answered softly but distinctly, "I am here against my wishes and you against yours. What are we, then, if not captives together?" A flicker, something between pain and recognition, crossed his austere features, gone as swiftly as summer lightning. He inclined his head. "Captives, perhaps, but I will not add to your chains." The carriage lurched onward through the tempest, carrying them toward the great iron gates that guarded Blackthorn land. Behind them, the cathedral bells faded into the wind. Ahead, the castle's beacon torch burned lone and steady on the highest tower, guiding them home through the dark. And somewhere between the dying toll of bells and the promise of that distant flame, Seraphine felt the first faint stir of something she could not yet name, curiosity, perhaps, or the slender, perilous beginning of hope. The carriage wheels ground over wet gravel as the great iron gates of Castle Blackthorn swung inward, torches flaring in the wind like wary sentinels. Beyond lay a courtyard lashed by rain, its ancient cobblestones gleaming black beneath the storm. The castle itself rose in tiers of weathered granite, its towers clawing at the bruised sky, windows glowing amber against the night like eyes newly opened after long slumber. Waves crashed far below the precipice on which it stood, their roar a constant, restless underscoring to every human sound. Footmen in sodden livery appeared with lanterns, their faces composed yet bright with the subdued excitement of witnessing a new mistress. They formed 2 silent lines from carriage to portico, heads bowed against the gale. Seraphine stepped down upon Cashin's offered hand. Steady, impersonal, withdrawn the instant she found her balance. Rain needled her cheeks as she passed beneath the arched entrance, the great oak doors closing behind them with a thud that echoed through her bones like the ceiling of a crypt. Within, the entrance hall soared into shadow, its vaulted ceiling lost in gloom. A vast fireplace of carved basalt burned low, casting long fingers of light across flagstones worn hollow by centuries of footsteps. Suits of armor stood sentinel along the walls, visors dark and empty. Above the mantel, a blackened shield bore the Blackthorn raven. Wings spread, beak open in eternal warning. Portraits of past lords and ladies gazed down from paneled walls. Stern men in ruff or armor, women in stiff brocade or mourning velvet, every face marked by the same resolute melancholy, as though sorrow were the true inheritance of the house. The household staff waited in perfect ranks. Butler, housekeeper, maids in starched gray, footmen in black. Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, a tall woman of 50 with iron-bound hair and eyes sharp as winter stars, curtsied deeply. "Welcome home, my lord, my lady." Her voice was low, precise, betraying neither warmth nor judgment. The staff followed suit, a rustle of fabric and murmured greetings that seemed to vanish into the vastness overhead. Cashin acknowledged them with a brief nod. "Mrs. Harrow, see that Lady Blackthorn is made comfortable. No demands will be made upon her this night, nor any night hence without her express wish." The words, quietly spoken, carried through the hall with absolute authority. A flicker of surprise passed across several faces, quickly veiled, yet Seraphine caught it. Clearly, such deference to a bride's autonomy was not the Blackthorn tradition. He turned to her then, rain still glittering on the shoulders of his greatcoat. "Your chambers are prepared in the west wing. Should you require anything at all, ring and it will be brought. You are mistress here now." His tone held neither command nor plea, only a grave courtesy that somehow made the vast hall feel even lonelier. With a bow of impeccable formality, he withdrew up the sweeping staircase, footsteps fading into upper darkness until even the echo ceased. Mrs. Harrow gestured, and two maids stepped forward with candles. Seraphine followed them through corridors paneled in dark oak, past tapestries of shipwrecks and sea battles faded to ghosts of color. Every window rattled softly in the wind. Somewhere water dripped in steady rhythm. The air smelled of salt, old stone, and beeswax. At last they reached a heavy door carved with ravens and waves. It opened into a suite of rooms that took her breath with their solemn beauty. The sitting room was paneled in pale walnut, its hearth already laid with a roaring fire of driftwood that snapped blue and green. Windows looked west over the raging sea. Even through closed casements she could hear the surf's endless assault upon the rocks below. A writing desk stood beneath one window, stocked with fresh parchment and ink. Bookshelves lined one wall, volumes of poetry, maritime history, botany. None of the frivolous novels she might have expected. The bedroom beyond was dominated by a vast four-poster hung in deep indigo velvet, its carvings echoing the door, ravens in flight over stormy waves. The bed linens were pristine white, turned down with military precision. A dressing room adjoined, already supplied with her modest trousseau. Gowns unpacked and hung, though the castle's wardrobes could have swallowed 10 times the number. Upon the dressing table rested a single silver-backed brush and a small vase containing one white camellia, perfect and luminous against the dark wood. The maids curtsied and withdrew. Seraphine was alone. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against cold glass. Far below, lightning revealed whitecaps marching in endless ranks, smashing themselves to foam against the cliff. The sight matched the tumult within her. Relief that no claiming had come this night, confusion at the courtesy that granted it, and a deeper, aching awareness of her isolation. This was her home now, a fortress perched on the edge of the world, beautiful and terrible. She turned back to the room. Upon the mantel above the fire rested a small porcelain clock ticking softly, its face painted with ships under full sail. Beside it lay a single volume, leather-bound and worn, the Mariner's Compass, annotated in a precise masculine hand. A marker of pressed sea lavender lay between pages describing the treacherous currents off Virmore. Someone, Cashin himself, had left it there deliberately. Seraphine sank into a wing chair before the fire, still in her damp traveling cloak. The flames painted shifting gold across her face, catching the unshed tears that now, in utter privacy, threatened to fall. She was safe for tonight at least. No brute had dragged her to the marriage bed. Yet safety felt strangely like abandonment. She was a guest in her own prison, granted every courtesy except the one thing she had never possessed: choice. Hours passed. The storm raged on, wind howling in the chimneys like lost souls. At last exhaustion drew her to the vast bed. She dismissed the waiting maid with a gesture, unwilling to endure even kindly scrutiny. Beneath heavy covers she lay listening to the castle settle around her. Creaks of ancient timber, distant slams of doors, the ceaseless voice of the sea. Sleep came slowly, threaded with dreams of drowning in indigo waves while a silver-haired figure stood upon the cliff, watching but never reaching. In the morning the storm had spent itself, leaving a world washed clean. Weak sunlight filtered through high clouds, glittering on wet stone. Seraphine woke to find a breakfast tray waiting. Tea, fresh bread, honey, and another single white camellia. No note accompanied it, yet the message was clear. She was seen, considered, but not pursued. Thus began her life in the citadel of silence. Mistress of a castle that breathed with old sorrows, wife to a man who had granted her freedom within walls she had yet to test. And somewhere in the vastness of Blackthorn, Lord Cashin walked alone, keeping every promise he had made, and perhaps wondering whether solitude, long his companion, might yet prove the cruelest chain of all. Days bled into one another at Castle Blackthorn like tides retreating and returning, each leaving a little less of the storm behind. Seraphine woke each morning to the same quiet ritual. A tray bearing tea strong enough to brace the heart, warm bread, salted butter, and always a single white camellia floating in a porcelain bowl. No note ever accompanied it, yet the flower's presence spoke with unmistakable clarity. Someone had risen before dawn, walked the glasshouses, and chosen it for her alone. She began to explore the castle in cautious increments, as though testing thin ice. The long gallery with its storm-faded tapestries of ancient voyages, the armory where blades slept in velvet gloom, the chapel whose stained glass turned the sea's restless greens and grays into fractured jewels upon the stone floor. Everywhere she went, servants inclined their heads with impeccable deference, yet their eyes held the same watchful curiosity she had seen on her arrival night. They were waiting, she realized, to see what manner of mistress she would prove. Cashin himself remained a courteous shadow. He breakfasted early and alone in his study, rode the cliffs at mid-morning, and dined in the great hall only when correspondence demanded it. When their paths crossed, and they did, inevitably, in corridors wide enough for armies, he greeted her with a grave inclination of the head and a murmured "My lady," before continuing on his way. He never lingered, never imposed conversation, yet neither did he avoid her gaze. Those storm-gray eyes held hers for the space of a heartbeat, assessing, acknowledging, then releasing. On the fifth morning, a leather-bound volume appeared upon her breakfast tray beside the camellia, a rare edition of Coleridge's maritime poems, its margins lightly annotated in a hand she now recognized as his. One passage was marked, a description of an albatross gliding over endless waves, with a single pressed frond of sea lavender tucked between the pages. Seraphine traced the delicate purple bloom with a fingertip, wondering at the mind that had preserved it years ago, perhaps during some solitary voyage. That afternoon she ventured onto the wild coastal path that skirted the cliffs. Wind tore at her cloak, salt stung her cheeks, and gulls wheeled overhead screaming defiance at the sky. Below, the sea hurled itself against black rocks in ceaseless fury, yet the violence felt strangely cleansing. She walked until her legs ached and her hair escaped its pins entirely, honey-brown strands whipping across her face like pennants of surrender. When she turned back, the castle loomed against scudding clouds, less fortress now and more ancient creature crouched upon the edge of the world. In the library that evening, 3 stories of oak shelves rising into perfumed gloom, she discovered more evidence of the man who had granted her solitude. A heavy atlas lay open upon a stand, its pages marked with careful notes on currents and prevailing winds. Beside it rested a portfolio of watercolors, precise renderings of headlands, lighthouses, the skeletal ribs of wrecked ships half buried in sand. The hand was confident, sensitive to light and shadow, revealing a patience she had not expected in the austere Lord of Blackthorn. One sketch stopped her breath. A lone figure in a dark cloak standing upon these very cliffs, hair streaming in the wind, face turned toward the horizon. The posture was unmistakably her own, captured the very afternoon she had walked. He had watched from some high window, recorded the moment without her knowledge, yet left the drawing here where she might find it. Not possession, but observation. Not claim, but recognition. She closed the portfolio with trembling fingers and moved to the great oriel window. Night had fallen. The sea was a restless black void pricked by the distant flash of a lighthouse. Somewhere in this vast house, Cashin sat alone with his charts and his memories. What had taught him such restraint? What losses had convinced him that love forced was love poisoned? The following week brought small gifts that arrived without ceremony. A cashmere shawl the color of sea fog left draped across her chair, a volume of Mary Somerville's astronomical treatises placed upon her desk, a sprig of winter jasmine in a crystal vase upon the pianoforte in the music room. Each item chosen with uncanny precision, as though he had studied her tastes in secret. She began to play again, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The instrument, a Broadwood grand long neglected, responded to her touch with rich, mournful resonance that carried through empty corridors. One dusk she chose a Beethoven sonata, its stormy passages mirroring the weather outside. When the final chord died away, she sensed rather than heard a presence in the doorway. Cashin stood half in shadow, one hand resting against the frame, listening. Their eyes met across the room. For the first time, something softened in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant pleasure. He did not speak, only inclined his head in silent appreciation before withdrawing as quietly as he had come. Seraphine's fear began to unravel thread by thread. The castle no longer felt like a tomb but a place holding its breath, waiting to see whether she would remain a prisoner of expectation or claim the freedom he had offered. She caught herself watching for his tall figure in the galleries, listening for the measured cadence of his footsteps. Not desire, not yet. Something quieter, more perilous. Curiosity blooming into fascination. On the 14th night she left her chamber door unlocked, not as invitation but experiment. She sat by the fire in her dressing gown, hair loose about her shoulders, reading the Coleridge until the words blurred. Midnight came and went. No knock sounded, no shadow darkened her threshold. The message was gentle but unmistakable. The choice remained hers alone. She slept deeply for the first time since arriving, dreaming not of drowning but of standing upon the cliff's edge with the wind at her back and an unseen presence steady beside her. When morning light woke her, another white camellia waited upon the tray, its petals edged with the faintest trace of dew, as though freshly gathered while the house still slept. Thus the slow unraveling continued. Fear yielding to wonder, isolation giving way to tentative connection across the careful distance he maintained. In the vast silence of Castle Blackthorn, two guarded hearts circled one another like ships in fog, guided only by small deliberate beacons of kindness, waiting for the moment when one would dare to alter course. A thin winter sun hung low over the sea when Seraphine, restless with the quiet that had begun to feel companionable rather than oppressive, ventured into the east wing, a part of the castle she had hitherto avoided. The corridors there were narrower, the air heavier with the scent of disuse and old cedar. Windows were fewer, their light muted by centuries of salt haze. Portraits here were older, darker, the faces more severe, as though the house itself grew more guarded the deeper one delved. She had come seeking the conservatory Mrs. Harrow had mentioned in passing, a glass house said to shelter oranges and camellias through the fiercest gales. Instead, a half-concealed door at the end of a dim passage caught her attention. Smaller than the others, its panels carved with intertwining briar roses rather than the ubiquitous ravens. The latch yielded to her touch with surprising ease, as though it had been awaiting her. Beyond lay a round chamber, windowless, lit only by a single hanging lantern that burned day and night on a short chain. The walls were lined with books, slender volumes of poetry, journals bound in soft leather, a few maritime logs. But it was the far wall that stilled her breath. A life-sized portrait dominated the space. A woman of perhaps 30, seated in a high-backed chair beside an open window through which stormy sea and sky could be seen. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, her dark hair unbound and falling in waves over one shoulder. Her face was beautiful in the way of porcelain just before it shatters, delicate, pale, touched by an indefinable sorrow. But it was the eyes that held Seraphine transfixed, wide, luminous, and filled with a quiet, unbearable knowledge. Beneath the painting, A brass plate read, Isolde Blackthorne, Lady of Blackthorne, 1798 to 1829. Cassion's first wife. Dead nearly 20 years. Seraphine had heard whispers in the province. Of a love match gone tragically wrong. Of fever or drowning or heartbreak, depending on who told the tale. Yet no one had spoken of her since Seraphine's arrival, as though the name itself were a wound still raw. She stepped closer. Isolde's gaze seemed to follow her, not with accusation but with weary compassion, as though she recognized the tremor in a younger woman's hands. Upon a small table beneath the portrait rested a single object, a journal bound in faded blue velvet, its pages swollen with years. It lay open, a ribbon marking a place, almost inviting touch. Seraphine hesitated only a moment before lifting it. The handwriting within was Cassion's, younger, less controlled, the ink occasionally smudged as though written in haste or emotion. October 15, 1828. She fades a little more each day. The physicians speak of consumption, of sea air, of rest, of everything except the truth. It is not her lungs that fail her, but her heart. She says she cannot breathe in this house, that the walls listen and judge. I brought her the camellias she loved. She smiled, but the smile broke halfway. They will outlive me, she whispered, as everything here outlives joy. I would burn the castle stone by stone if it would give her one more year. But she begs me not to chain her to life when her spirit has already taken flight. God forgive me, I do not know how to let her go. A later entry, dated months after Isolde's death. April 3, 1829. I stood upon the cliff where we once watched storms together and swore an oath to the wind and the waves. Never again will I bind a soul to this place against its will. Never again will I mistake possession for love. If fate ever brings another woman beneath this roof as my wife, I will offer her every freedom I denied my Isolde. Even if that freedom means she chooses to leave me. Better solitude than another light extinguished by these walls. The words blurred as Seraphine read. Tears, unexpected, hot, slid down her cheeks. She closed the journal with reverence and looked again at the portrait. Isolde's expression, once merely sorrowful, now seemed knowing, almost conspiratorial. You see now, he is not cold. He is afraid. Footsteps sounded softly in the corridor. Measured. Familiar. Seraphine turned as Cassion appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He had clearly not expected to find her here. Surprise flickered across his face, followed swiftly by something deeper. Pain, long banked but never dead. He did not reprimand her for trespass. Instead, he remained upon the threshold, one hand resting against the frame as though needing its support. You have found her, he said quietly. The words held neither anger nor defense, only acknowledgement. Seraphine's voice trembled. I am sorry. The door was unlatched. I did not mean to intrude upon grief. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with care. The lantern light caught the silver in his hair, the new lines of strain about his mouth. This room is not forbidden, he said, only avoided. By me most of all. His gaze moved to the portrait, lingering there as though greeting an old companion. She was light itself when she came here. Within 5 years the light had gone out. Seraphine clutched the journal to her chest. You blame yourself. I blame the arrogance of believing love could be commanded, or that gratitude could be mistaken for affection. His tone was even, but the words carried the weight of stone. I was younger then, proud of my name, my holdings. I thought devotion would follow marriage as surely as tide follows moon. I was wrong. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant murmur of the sea. At last he met her eyes. The key I gave you on our wedding night, it was not mere courtesy. It was penance. A vow kept. A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. I swore I would not cage another heart, even if the cage were gilded. Seraphine felt something shift within her, an understanding too vast for the small chamber. The man before her was not the remote lord of rumor, nor the austere guardian of distance. He was a widower who had loved deeply, lost catastrophically, and chosen exile over the risk of causing such harm again. She laid the journal gently back upon its table. "And if," she said softly, "the heart in question no longer wishes to be free of the house or its master?" His breath caught almost imperceptibly. For the first time since their marriage, the careful mask slipped entirely, revealing raw wonder and fear in equal measure. "Then," he answered, voice roughened, "I would need to learn how to be worthy of such a gift." They stood thus, inches apart in the lantern's golden circle, the portrait of Isolde watching over them like a silent benediction. Outside, clouds parted and sunlight struck the sea, turning it for one brief moment to molten silver. In that chamber of old sorrow, something new and fragile took root. The first true bridge between captivity and choice, between duty and desire. The midpoint had been reached, not with thunder, but with the quiet turning of a long-buried page. The fragile equilibrium that had begun to settle over Castle Blackthorn shattered with the arrival of the first winter visitors. A letter came by swift rider one iron-gray morning, its wax seal bearing the crest of the Earl of Dunrock, Seraphine's late father's closest ally, and one of the province's most indefatigable gossips. The Earl and his party, it announced, intended to pay their respects to the new Lady Blackthorn and would arrive within the fortnight, weather permitting. Refusal was not contemplated. The laws of hospitality in Vermoor were as binding as any oath. Cashin read the missive at the breakfast table, taken together now, though still in near silence, and his brow darkened. "Dunrock delights in stirring still waters," he said quietly. "You need not receive them if you prefer solitude." Seraphine lifted her chin. "They will come regardless. Better to face them here, upon ground of my choosing, than allow rumor to fester unchecked." He studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration in his eyes. "As you wish, my lady." Preparations began at once. Mrs. Harrow marshaled the staff with military precision. Fires were laid in long-unused guest chambers, silver polished until it blazed, hothouse flowers forced into extravagant bloom. Seraphine chose menus, arranged music, inspected linens. Small acts of authority that steadied her nerves. She had been mistress in name for weeks. Now she would play the part before an audience that expected her to fail. The party arrived on a day of fitful sun and scudding cloud, carriages splashing through the gates like a small invasion. Lord Dunrock, portly, florid, eyes bright with curiosity, led the procession, followed by his sharp-featured wife, their unmarried daughter, and a cluster of lesser relations. Seraphine received them in the great hall, gowned in deep emerald velvet that brought out the gold in her hair. Standing beside Cashin with composure she did not entirely feel. Greetings were effusive, embraces cloying. Lady Dunrock pressed Seraphine's hands and declared, "My dear child, how pale you look! Sea air is healthful, but one must take care not to grow too ethereal." Her gaze flicked to Cashin with practiced sympathy. "And you, my lord, still bearing your burdens with such stoicism. Admirable, truly." Wine was served in the solar overlooking the cliffs. Conversation began innocently enough. Harvest yields, the new lighthouse at Morven Point, but soon veered, as Seraphine had known it would, into more dangerous waters. Miss Dunrock, a bold girl of 19 with ringlets and calculating eyes, leaned forward. "They say Castle Blackthorn is haunted by melancholy itself. Do you find it so, Lady Blackthorn? Or has marriage proved restorative?" Seraphine smiled thinly. "The castle is ancient, as are its moods. I find it suits me well enough." Lord Dunrock chuckled over his glass. "Come now, we are old friends of your family. Speak plainly." The match was sudden, necessary, one hears, but necessity and happiness are not always companions. His tone was jovial, but the barb landed true. Cassion's voice cut across the room like a cold blade. Lady Blackthorn's happiness is her own concern, and mine, not fodder for drawing-room speculation. Silence fell, brittle as thin ice. Lady Dunrock hastened to fill it with chatter about fashions in the capital. But the damage was done. Seraphine felt every eye upon her, measuring, pitying, waiting for the crack. That evening at dinner the assault grew subtler but no less relentless. Seated beside Lady Dunrock, Seraphine endured a litany of whispered counsel. Men of Lord Blackthorn's years often seek an heir above all else, my dear. Kindness can be strategic. Do not mistake restraint for indifference. Once the cradle is filled, attentions may wander or cease entirely. Across the table, Miss Dunrock engaged Cassion in bright conversation about his maritime charts, laughing at trifles, laying a familiar hand upon his sleeve. He responded with courtesy, nothing more, yet Seraphine felt each touch like a needle. Later, alone in her chamber, she stood before the mirror unpinning her hair with shaking fingers. The woman reflected looked composed, elegant even, but the eyes were haunted. Had Cassion's gifts, his distance, his vow-born restraint all been mere calculation? A way to secure a compliant broodmare while keeping his heart safely buried with Isolde? Sleep eluded her. She wandered the corridors by candlelight, drawn inevitably to the round chamber in the east wing. Isolde's portrait gazed down in the flickering glow, serene and tragic. Seraphine opened the velvet journal again, turning to entries she had not yet read. February 12, 1829. She asked me today why I no longer touch her. I could not tell her the truth, that every caress feels like theft now, stealing breath she cannot spare. She thinks herself unwanted. God help me, I have failed her even in this. The words struck like a blow. Restraint born not of indifference, but of terror. Yet how was Seraphine to know the difference when every visitor's whisper insisted otherwise? The following days brought no respite. Walks were interrupted by chance encounters with Miss Dunrock, eager to display her familiarity with the castle grounds. Paths Cassion had supposedly shown her on childhood visits. Meals became battlegrounds of insinuation. Even Mrs. Harrow, usually impassive, began to watch Seraphine with something approaching concern. On the fourth night, snow began to fall, thick, swirling flakes that blotted out the sea and turned the world to muffled white. The visitors declared themselves storm-bound, delighted at the prospect of further intimacy. Seraphine retreated to the library, seeking solace among books, only to find Lord Dunrock already ensconced by the fire. "Ah, my dear," he said, closing his volume with a snap. "A word, if I may. Your father was my dearest friend. I cannot stand silent while," he sighed heavily. "Blackthorn is a good man in his way, but he is damaged. The First Lady Blackthorn's death unhinged him. Some say he blames himself still. He will never love again as a younger man might. You deserve more than dutiful tolerance." Seraphine's voice was steady, though her heart hammered. "I am not a child to be advised on my deserts, my lord. No, but you are young, and youth mistakes patience for coldness, solitude for rejection." He leaned forward, earnest now. "There are those who would offer you warmth, were you free." The implication hung rank in the air. Seraphine rose, pride armoring her. "I am precisely where I choose to be." But as she left the library, doubt clung like damp from the snow. The whispers had done their work. The careful bridge she and Cassion had begun to build now seemed built on sand. She passed his study, door ajar, firelight spilling gold across the threshold, and heard Miss Dunrock's laughter within, bright and intimate. She did not pause. She walked on, through corridors that suddenly felt colder than the storm outside, wondering whether the key in her pocket unlocked a door to freedom, or merely guarded a prettier cage. The snow that had prolonged the visitor's stay thickened into a blizzard that sealed Castle Blackthorn from the world for a full fortnight. Roads vanished beneath drifts. The sea itself seemed frozen in mid-rage, its waves sluggish and gray under iron skies. Within the castle, fires burned day and night, yet warmth felt illusory. The whispers of the Dunrock party had taken root in Seraphine's mind like frost in stone. Silent, insidious, impossible to dislodge. She withdrew further into herself. Meals were taken in her rooms, walks abandoned. The pianoforte stood silent. Even the white camellias, still appearing each morning with faithful regularity, began to feel like offerings at a shrine she no longer wished to tend. Cashin noticed, of course he noticed, but honored her retreat with the same scrupulous distance he had shown from the beginning. His gaze followed her when they passed in corridors, concern etched faintly in the lines about his eyes, but he asked no questions, made no demands. On the 10th night of the storm, wind howled down the chimneys with demonic fury, rattling windows and snuffing candles. Seraphine, sleepless, wrapped herself in a heavy shawl and wandered the darkened halls by feel more than sight. Memory guided her feet to the great library, its vast windows facing the worst of the gale. Moonlight, thin and cold, filtered through swirling snow to paint the room in ghostly silver. She found Cashin there, alone. He stood at the central oriel window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the tempest as though it were an old adversary. A single branch of candles burned upon a table nearby, gilding his profile in shifting gold. He wore no coat, only shirt and waistcoat, his silver hair unbound and falling to his collar. The posture was familiar, solitary, enduring, yet tonight it struck her as unbearably lonely. He sensed her presence and turned. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something gentler. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I did not know you were here." "You need no forgiveness for walking your own house, Seraphine." He used her name rarely. Hearing it now, soft upon his tongue, pierced her more sharply than any rebuke. Silence stretched, filled by the storm's roar. At last she could bear it no longer. "Tell me the truth," she said, voice trembling despite her effort at steadiness. "Is this?" She gestured between them, at the vast room, the castle beyond. "All strategy? A courteous pretense until duty is fulfilled and an heir secured? The key, the books, the flowers, are they merely lures to keep me compliant?" The words tumbled out raw and ragged, weeks of doubt given sudden voice. She had not meant to confront him thus, yet the storm seemed to demand honesty as fiercely as it demanded surrender from the sea. Cashin's face paled beneath the candlelight. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her with an intensity that made her want to flee. At last he spoke, low and even. "You believe me capable of such calculated cruelty?" "I do not know what you are capable of," she answered, tears rising hot and unwelcome. "You keep yourself locked away more securely than any door in this house. You give me freedom, yes, but freedom to what? To wander rooms filled with ghosts while you remain forever beyond reach? I am tired of guessing, my lord. Tired of wondering whether I am wife or merely obligation." He moved then, crossing the space between them in 3 measured strides. Close enough that she could see the storm reflected in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him against the chill. "Look at me," he said quietly. When she did, he continued, voice roughened with something perilously near anguish. "Everything I have done, every distance I have kept, was to spare you the fate of the woman in that portrait. Isolde came here willingly, lovingly even, and I destroyed her with the weight of my expectations. I will not repeat that sin." Seraphine shook her head, tears spilling now. "But you destroy me too in another way, by making me feel unnecessary, as though my presence changes nothing." A muscle worked in his jaw. "You change everything," he said. The words dragged from him as though each cost blood. "Every morning I cut the camellia myself, wondering if today you will smile at it. Every evening I listen for your music and grieve when it does not come. I have lived 20 years in silence, Seraphine. Your footsteps in these halls are the first sound that has felt like hope." He stopped, breathing uneven, as though astonished at his own confession. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. An impossibility in snow, yet there it was, a low growling admonition. Seraphine's anger fractured under the weight of his words. "Then why," she whispered, "do you hide from me?" "Because I am afraid." The admission came simply, devastatingly. "Afraid that if I reach for you, I will hold too tightly. Afraid that you will stay out of gratitude or loneliness rather than desire. Afraid that 27 years between us is a chasm I have no right to ask you to bridge." The room seemed to contract around them, the storm's fury suddenly distant. Seraphine saw him clearly at last. Not the austere lord, not the grieving widower, but a man standing at the edge of a precipice he had long believed impassable. She took one step closer, then another, until scarcely a hand's breadth separated them. "I crossed that chasm the moment I read your vow beside a soul's portrait," she said softly. "I am not here out of gratitude, Cashin. I am here because I choose to be, but choice must be met with choice." His eyes searched hers, hope and terror warring in their depths. "And if I choose wrongly?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Then we will bear it together," she answered. "But do not choose solitude for my sake. That is the one chain I cannot endure." For a heartbeat the world held still. Then, slowly, as though fearing she might vanish, he lifted one hand to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was feather-light, reverent. "I have been a coward," he murmured. "No," she said, "only careful with what is precious." The candles guttered in a sudden draft. Outside, the wind shifted, beginning its long retreat. Snow still fell, but softer now, as though the storm itself had spent its rage. They stood thus until the candles burned low, two figures in a vast library, no longer divided by distance or doubt, but not yet joined. The lowest tide had been reached, every fear spoken, every wound laid bare. In the silence that followed, something began, tentatively, to mend. Dawn would bring clearing skies and, eventually, departure for the Dunrock party. But in this night, at the deepest ebb, Seraphine understood that the true storm had passed. What remained was the long, uncertain, luminous work of choosing each other anew. The storm that had ravaged Veermore for weeks finally broke at dawn, leaving behind a world scoured clean and fragile as new ice. Snow lay deep upon the castle grounds, muffling every sound save the distant drip of melting eaves and the occasional cry of seabirds wheeling over a calmed ocean. The Dunrock party, sensing the shift in weather and perhaps the tension within Blackthorn's walls, announced their departure over a subdued breakfast. Farewells were exchanged in the courtyard. Curt bows, cool embraces, promises of future visits that rang hollow as empty bells. Seraphine watched from the battlements as the carriages receded down the cliff road, a plume of fresh snow in their wake. Relief washed through her, mingled with exhaustion. The whispers had departed with their bearers, but the doubts they had sown lingered like shadows at noon, faint yet undeniable. She turned back toward the castle, its granite towers now gleaming under weak sunlight, and wondered whether the fragile understanding reached with Cashin in the library could withstand the quiet that followed. He found her in the conservatory that afternoon, a domed structure of iron and glass jutting from the south wing like a jewel upon the cliff's edge. Inside, warmth from coal braziers coaxed life from exotic plants. Oranges heavy on slender branches, ferns unfurling like secrets, and rows of camellias blooming in defiant white against the winter beyond. Seraphine sat upon a wrought iron bench, a forgotten book in her lap, staring at the sea through frost-etched panes. Cashin entered quietly, carrying a small tray with tea and honeyed biscuits. He set it upon a low table and took the seat opposite her, movements deliberate, giving her space to withdraw if she wished. "The air clears," he said, pouring for them both. Steam rose in lazy curls, scented with bergamot. She accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his briefly, a contact that sent warmth racing up her arm. "As does the house," she replied, "though I fear the echoes remain." He nodded, gaze steady upon hers. "Last night's words. They were long overdue. I have guarded my solitude too fiercely, mistaking protection for wisdom." Seraphine sipped her tea, gathering thoughts scattered by the storm's revelations. "And I have let others' voices drown my own. Dunrock and his ilk, they see only surfaces. They cannot comprehend a man who offers choice when the world demands submission." A faint smile touched his lips, transforming the austerity of his features into something almost boyish. "Nor a woman who claims that choice with such quiet fire." They spoke then, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. Not of fears, that ground had been trod in darkness, but of simpler things. The books that had shaped them, the seas they had known. Cashin described voyages in his youth, charting unknown coasts under stars that seemed closer upon open water. Seraphine shared memories of her father's modest library, where she had first discovered the poetry of waves and wind. As sunlight slanted lower, casting golden bars across the flagstones, conversation turned inward. "Tell me," she said softly, "what you envision for this house, not as it was, but as it might become." He considered, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger. "A place where shadows give way to light, where music fills the halls again, and laughter is not a stranger." His eyes met hers. "Where two people might build something neither could alone." The words hung between them, an invitation wrapped in possibility. Seraphine felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the thrill of decision. That evening, dinner was taken in the small parlor adjoining her chambers. Intimate, warmed by a single hearth. They dined on simple fare, roast fowl, winter roots, wine the color of rubies. Conversation flowed like the tide now, ebbing and advancing without force. Cashin shared a tale of a shipwreck he had witnessed as a boy, the survivor's gratitude teaching him the value of unearned mercy. Seraphine countered with a childhood escapade, sneaking to the shore to collect shells that whispered secrets when held to the ear. As the meal ended, he rose to withdraw, bowing with his customary grace. "Good night, my lady. May your dreams be kind." She watched him go, the door closing softly behind. The key lay upon her dressing table, silver and unassuming, a symbol of the power he had placed in her hands. For weeks she had turned it each night, locking out not him, but her own uncertainties. Tonight, she left it untouched. She prepared for bed with deliberate care. Hair brushed until it shone, a nightgown of pale linen that whispered against her skin. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows upon the walls. She slipped beneath the covers, heart pounding in rhythm with the distant sea. Sleep did not come. Instead, she lay listening to the castle's nocturnal symphony, the creak of settling beams, the soft sigh of wind in the eaves. Hours passed. Midnight tolled from the distant chapel. Still no knock came. Disappointment warred with understanding. He had vowed not to impose. Perhaps he interpreted her silence as continued need for space. Yet the unlocked door was her signal, clear as any spoken word. Rising, she wrapped herself in a robe of deep blue velvet and took a single candle. The flame trembled as she stepped into the corridor, its light pooling gold upon the stones. Cashin's chambers lay in the north tower, a short walk through moonlit galleries. She moved silently, slippers making no sound, guided by memory and the faint glow from beneath his door. She paused outside, hand raised to knock, then hesitated. What if he turned her away? What if this bridge, so tentatively begun, collapsed under the weight of presumption? Before doubt could claim her, the door opened. Cashin stood there, still clothed, a book open in one hand as though he too had been unable to find rest. His eyes widened fractionally, then softened with wonder. "Seraphine," he breathed. "I left my door unlocked," she said, voice steady despite the tremor within. "When you did not come, I thought, perhaps you needed the invitation made clearer." He stepped aside, gesturing her in. The room was sparse yet warm. A wide bed hung in crimson, a desk strewn with charts, a fire crackling merrily. Books lined every wall. A telescope stood sentinel at the window, aimed at the star-scattered sky. "I feared to misread," he admitted, closing the door. "To assume where I had no right." She set the candle upon a table, its light mingling with the hearth's glow. "Then let there be no assumptions. I am here because I choose to be, not out of duty or loneliness or the whispers of others. Because I see you now, the man behind the legend, and I wish to know him better." He approached slowly, as though she were a wild creature that might flee. When he stood before her, he lifted one hand to tuck a stray lock behind her ear, the gesture infinitely tender. "And I," he murmured, "wish to deserve such trust." Their fingers intertwined, a bridge of flesh and bone. No more was said that night. Words had carried them this far. In the quiet honesty of shared space, they sat before the fire, shoulders touching, watching embers fade to ash. When dawn crept through the windows, painting the room in rose and gold, Seraphine rested her head upon his shoulder, and he did not pull away. The turning of the key had been hers alone, but in leaving it unturned, a tentative bridge formed, spanning the chasm of years and sorrow. Castle Blackthorn, once a citadel of isolation, began to pulse with the quiet rhythm of two hearts learning, at last, to beat in unison. Spring had begun to soften the edges of Vermoor, turning the cliffs green with new growth and coaxing early wildflowers from the thin soil. Yet inside Castle Blackthorn, a different season stirred, one of tentative warmth after long winter. Since the night Seraphine had crossed the threshold into Cassion's tower chamber, the distance between them had not vanished in a rush of passion, but had dissolved slowly, deliberately, like snow under steady sun. They met now in shared spaces, mornings in the conservatory over tea, afternoons walking the coastal path where gulls cried overhead, evenings in the library where firelight painted gold across turning pages. Conversation deepened, memories offered like precious shells gathered from hidden coves. Touch came gradually, a hand steadied on an arm during a steep descent, fingers lingering when passing a book, a palm briefly against a cheek to brush away wind-tossed hair. Still, the final barrier remained. Cassion's restraint, forged in grief and tempered by vow, held him back from claiming what duty had long entitled him to take. Seraphine felt it in every careful withdrawal, every kiss pressed to her knuckles rather than her lips. He feared to overwhelm. She began to fear he would never dare. On a night when thunderheads gathered again over the sea, echoing the storm that had first bared their hearts, Seraphine found him in the observatory atop the north tower. The room was circular, its domed roof open to the sky on clear evenings, tonight closed against the coming rain. Charts lay scattered across a broad oak table. The telescope stood shrouded. Cassion leaned against the stone parapet, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. She approached without speaking, wrapping her shawl tighter against the rising wind. He turned at the soft fall of her slippers, eyes softening. "Another storm," she said, coming to stand beside him. "They always return," he answered. "But they pass." Lightning flared, illuminating his face in stark relief. The strong bones, the silver hair whipping across his brow, the mouth held in its habitual grave line. For the first time, Seraphine saw not restraint but longing held in fierce check. She laid her hand upon his sleeve. "Cassion." He covered her fingers with his own, warm and steady. "Yes, I am tired of passing storms," she said quietly. "I want the calm that comes after. With you." His breath caught. In the next flash of lightning she saw raw emotion break across his features. Hope too long denied. "Seraphine, I swore. I know what you swore." She stepped closer, until the heat of his body cut the wind. "You swore never to cage a heart. But mine flies freely toward you. Do you not see?" Thunder rolled closer now. Rain began to fall in heavy drops that hissed against stone. He lifted his free hand to her face, tracing the line of her cheek as though memorizing it. "I see only too well, and I am terrified of wanting too much." "Then want with me," she whispered. "Not for me. With me." The words shattered the last chain. He drew her into his arms with a sound halfway between groan and prayer. The kiss that followed was not gentle. It was 20 years of solitude breaking against present joy, tempered by reverence. His mouth moved over hers with the certainty of a man who had waited a lifetime to claim what was freely offered. Seraphine responded without hesitation, arms winding about his neck, fingers threading through silver hair that felt like cool silk. Rain lashed the tower as they stumbled back into the sheltered curve of the observatory wall. Lightning illuminated them in frozen moments. His hands sliding into her hair to tilt her head, her palms against his chest feeling the thunder of his heart, coats and shawls discarded in urgent need of closeness. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because from this moment on, nothing in this story remains the same. He lifted her against him, carrying her down the narrow spiral stair to his chamber without breaking the kiss. The door closed behind them with a soft thud that sounded like fate sealing at last. Inside, firelight welcomed them. Cashin set her down slowly, hands framing her face as he searched her eyes one final time. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice rough with restraint barely leashed. "And I will, even now." Seraphine answered by reaching for the buttons of his waistcoat, fingers steady despite the wildfire in her veins. "I want all of you," she said, "as you are, as we might become." Clothing fell away like old sorrows. Skin to skin at last, they learned each other with wondering hands and whispered names. Age and youth, grief and hope, fear and desire. All distinctions dissolved in the honest language of touch. When he entered her, it was with exquisite care, eyes locked, breath shared, until pleasure and completion swept them both into the same bright tide. Afterward, they lay tangled in crimson sheets, rain drumming steadily on the windows. Cashin traced idle patterns along her spine, as though assuring himself she was real. "I thought never to know this again," he murmured against her hair. "Not after Isolde." Seraphine pressed a kiss to his chest, just above his heart. "This is not again. This is new." He tightened his arms around her. "New," he echoed, wonder in the word. Dawn found them still awake, talking softly of small futures. Gardens to replant, music to fill empty rooms, perhaps, someday, a child's laughter echoing in halls that had known only silence. Outside, the storm had spent itself, leaving the world washed clean and glittering. The barriers of age, of sorrow, of careful distance, all had dissolved in chosen fire. Castle Blackthorn, long a monument to loss, became on that night a cradle for beginning. Two souls who had entered marriage as strangers emerged from the storm, bound not by law or duty, but by the rarest bond of all. Love freely sought, freely given, and finally claimed without fear. Years flowed over Castle Blackthorn like gentle tides, smoothing the jagged edges of old sorrow and depositing quiet treasures in their place. The first spring after the storm saw gardens long neglected burst into defiant color. Seraphine, with Cashin ever at her side, reclaimed forgotten rose beds and planted drifts of sea thrift along the cliff paths. The conservatory brimmed with new life. Lemon trees in terracotta pots, jasmine climbing the glass panes, camellias blooming in extravagant profusion. Servants who had served in silence for decades found themselves smiling at the sound of music drifting through open windows. Seraphine at the pianoforte, Cashin turning pages with a tenderness that made even Mrs. Harrow's stern eyes soften. Society, ever hungry for scandal, arrived expecting tragedy and found instead a mystery it could not unravel. Invitations were accepted sparingly, but when the great hall filled with guests, they witnessed a lord whose silver hair gleamed beneath chandeliers and whose eyes followed his young wife with unguarded devotion. They saw Seraphine, once pitted as a sacrificial lamb, move through her domain with the calm authority of one who had chosen her place and claimed it utterly. Whispers changed timbre, from pity to puzzlement, from mockery to reluctant awe. "She looks at him," Lady Dunrock was heard to mutter at a provincial assembly, "as though she chose the match herself." In the 3rd year of their true marriage, a daughter was born on a night of rare summer calm. They named her Isolde, not in mourning but in benediction, after the woman whose portrait now hung in sunlight rather than shadow, her sorrowful eyes softened by the laughter echoing below. The child had her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's storm-gray eyes, and from her earliest days she ruled the castle with dimpled imperiousness. Cassian, to the astonishment of those who remembered him only as austere legend, could often be found in the nursery on his knees, building towers of painted blocks or recounting tales of stars and ships while small hands clutched his fingers in complete trust. The province told new stories now, of how Lord Blackthorn had carried his lady across the cliff path during a sudden squall, both laughing like children as rain soaked them through, of how Lady Blackthorn played Beethoven under the stars on midsummer nights, her husband listening from the shadows with the expression of a man perpetually astonished by grace, of the white camellias that appeared each anniversary upon the breakfast table, never fewer than the years they had shared, always gathered by Cassian's own hand before dawn. One autumn evening, 7 years after the night the storm broke into dawn, Seraphine and Cassian stood together upon the highest battlement. Their daughter slept below in the nursery. The sea stretched before them like polished obsidian under a crescent moon. Wind carried the scent of salt and late roses. Seraphine rested her head against his shoulder, his arm encircling her waist with the ease of long habit. "I was given to a lord of legend and shadow," she said softly, echoing words once spoken in fear. "But in his gift of freedom, I found my home." Cassian pressed a kiss to her temple. "And I, who believed time had stolen all capacity for joy, learned that love arrives not in youth's fire, but in the steady light of 2 hearts choosing each other anew each day." Below them, lights glowed warm in every window of Castle Blackthorn. No longer a citadel of silence, but a haven against the tide. The raven banner snapped in the breeze, yet the ancient stone seemed to breathe easier now, as though the house itself had been waiting centuries for this quiet happiness. Far out upon the water, a ship's lantern winked once, twice. Some mariner guided safely home by Blackthorn's beacon. Seraphine watched it until it vanished into the dark. "Choice," she murmured, fingers intertwined with his. "The rarest gift of all. And the only one worth giving," he answered. They stood thus until the moon climbed high, 2 figures silhouetted against the stars, equals forged in storm and tempered in peace. Behind them, the castle kept its ancient watch. Before them, the sea whispered eternal promises. And in the sacred ordinary moments between, shared glances, gentle touches, laughter rising like birds from long empty galleries, they lived the truth they had discovered together, that when love is offered without demand and accepted without chains, even the most wounded heart finds courage to bloom. That true haven is built not of stone or duty, but of daily, deliberate choice. Castle Blackthorn, once haunted by echoes, now rang with life, and upon its cliffs, beneath stars that had witnessed centuries of human longing, Seraphine and Cassian walked home hand in hand, not as lord and forced bride, not as widower and obligation, but as 2 souls who had, against every expectation, chosen each other freely, fiercely, forever.